Thanks for joining us. I'm Katty Kay of the BBC, sitting in for Diane Rehm. She's visiting station WUOM and Michigan Public Libraries. On April the 9th, 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered. 5 days later, John Wilkes Booth shot President Lincoln. 2 weeks after that, the steamship Sultana caught fire and sank in the Mississippi River. It remains the worst maritime disaster in American history. Journalist and author Alan Huffman tells this overlooked story in a new book. It's titled simply Sultana, and he joins me now in the studio. Thanks so much for coming in, Alan.
Thanks for having me.
We'll be opening the phones later on in the programme. The phone number here is 1-800-433-8850. You can send questions and comments to Alan at our email address, which is drshow@wmu.org. Let's start by describing this. You have on the front of your book a picture of the Sultana. Describe it to our audience.
Well, the boat is in the photograph. I mean, in the painting is in flames in the middle of the river, and you see a lot of rescue boats, and it's night, and you see people drifting down the river, clinging to debris. It's obviously a stylized painting, but it does evoke what was going on. The river was full of people. There were 2,400 people aboard a boat that was supposed to carry 375 roughly. And so after it exploded and caught fire, you had people on horses swimming in the river channel. Maybe in some cases there'd be 8 or 9 guys hanging on to one horse that was swimming down the channel trying to get to the banks, and people drowning each other, people floating on debris, and there was a lot going on out in the river that night.
And the boat itself, tell us about the Sultana.
The boat itself was a large steamboat that was designed for transporting cargo up and down the river. But during the war, most of the steamboats, there wasn't a lot of commerce, so most of the steamboats were used for troop transports. They had contracts with the federal government. And in this case, that's how the disaster came about. The owners of the Sultana and the captain of the Sultana had negotiated with the military in Vicksburg to bring these recently freed Union prisoners home from the war. So that's what was happening when they were being paid by the head to move these recently freed prisoners, and so they managed to put 2,400 on them.
So because they were paid by the head, they tried to squeeze onto this big wooden steamship.
Exactly.
As many as they could.
Right, exactly. And
And what were conditions like on a boat like the Sultana?
Well, it would have, you can just imagine, there were actually 100 passengers that were already on the boat when the soldiers were marched aboard. So I'm sure they were quite bemused as they watched the overloading of the boat in Vicksburg. The boat has, 3 or 4 levels if you count the pilot house. So you had open decks, and then you had the staterooms, that ran down the center of the boat. So
which is where the richer passengers would have gone.
Right. And unless you were in steerage, like any other boat, and you'd be down in the hold with the crew. But it wouldn't have mattered where you were, because even if you had a stateroom, the officers would have been crowded into that area, and the decks were just completely covered with men.
Was it a luxurious boat, the Sultana?
I think it was an average boat. It had a lot of wooden filigrees and that sort of thing on the pilot house, but from the accounts that I've read, it was not the top of the line boat. It was just a typical steamboat that was meant primarily for cargo and also took passengers.
So it would have had a dining room, that kind of thing.
Right, and would have had nice touches in the staterooms, and had its own china probably. Most steamboats did, and chandeliers hanging in the hallways and that sort of thing. So it would have been by our standards today, it would have been a very nice boat. There were more lavish boats in the era.
And when it took that fateful journey that night in April, was it still a fairly new boat? Had it been around for a while? What condition was it in?
It was in good condition. It was only a couple of years old. And so, but it had a couple of problems. One was the overcrowding was causing the decks to sag. And the crew of the boat were very concerned about that. And so they actually had hastily reinforced the decks with beams to support them, because so many men standing there. The other was there were problems with the boat's boilers. The boilers, which were fired by coal furnaces, and the boilers of the Sultana had already exhibited problems.
Even though they were only a couple of years old.
Right. It was a new design, an innovative design that was lighter weight, that was later discontinued, and so it was known that there were problems with this type of boiler, and in fact, the boilers had sprung a leak on the way from New Orleans to Vicksburg that had been hastily patched, even though the consensus was that really it needed more work.
Now, when you try and take an aeroplane today and there's the tiniest maintenance problem, of course, you're delayed for hours and hours, and often you have to change planes. It sounds like they knew that there was a potentially dangerous problem on board this boat, but she sailed anyway.
They absolutely knew, and they kept it secret. In fact, some of the soldiers who boarded the boat, few of them who were more curious than the others, heard hammering going on down in the engine room and checked it out and went down and saw them working on this patch on the boiler. And a few tried to get off the boat. Some perhaps did, and some moved to other sections of the boat because they perceived that there might be problems around the boiler. Exploding boilers was not new. The steamboat travel on the Mississippi River was very dangerous by nature. The boats did not last long.
Was it?
Yes, absolutely. The average lifespan of the boats on the river was generally less than 10 years. They were dangerous, and so these guys saw the work that was going on the boilers, and they said, well, we're moving to another part of the boat, So they knew, but they tried to keep it secret because they wanted to get these passengers. And two other boats actually left Vicksburg the same day empty because they were unable to get passengers while the Sultana was being overloaded.
Set the scene for us a little bit. As the Sultana is leaving Vicksburg, what does the Mississippi River look like in the 1800s?
Well, it looks similar to how it looks now, but obviously there would have been more along the river, as a result of floods. There's not as much development right on the river down there, but at this particular moment, the city of Vicksburg would have been ravaged by the war from continual naval bombardments in 1863. And there would have been a lot of boats tied up at the wharf, and the river was at flood stage. So it was very high, would have been full of logs and debris that were bumping up against the wharves, that sort of thing. And the currents, when the river is at flood stage, are just insane. They go every direction. There are standing waves out in the middle of the river. There are whirlpools coming up everywhere. It's there's this image of the river as, Old Man River. It's this lazy river, and all it takes is standing on the bank during a flood and watching it, and the last thing you think of is an old man.
Which presumably makes it more dangerous as well.
Absolutely. It's a very, very dangerous river at any stage, but particularly at flood stage. And what happened here was that these guys were already weak when they got on this boat. So it was pretty much the last group you would want to subject to what they were about to go through. Many of them had to be carried aboard because of their injuries or weaknesses. So,
tell me then the scene on that night, April 27th, 1865. The Sultana leaves Vicksburg, overcrowded.
Right.
What happens?
It stops en route to Memphis at Helena, Arkansas. And at that point, the only known photograph of the Sultana is taken by a photographer named T.W. Banks.
So it's still daylight.
It's a 2-day trip essentially. This is the day after it left Vicksburg. It docks there to I presume take on more coal, because that's usually why a steamboat stops. Maybe pick up a few passengers. Or discharge cargo, because even at this point, the Sultana did have cargo that it was bringing upriver from New Orleans. You mentioned Lincoln's assassination. That was part of the cargo that it carried down the river, was the news of Lincoln's assassination, because it was, that was one of the ways that news traveled during that time period. But it stopped in Helena, Arkansas, and the boat, actually, the men rushed to one side of the boat to be in this photograph. Everyone, of course, wanted to be in the photograph. Then it headed up north. It got to Memphis around sunset, and the men were told to stay on the boat, but no one was going to. These guys had been in prison. They had been at war. This is the first minute that they've had in a city of any size. They were getting off the boat. And so they did. And they went to the saloons down at the waterfront in Memphis. And they actually had a hard time getting some of them back on the boat.